Maya Callahan had been standing over bed 6 for exactly 40 seconds when she knew the patient was going to die if nobody acted in the next 2 minutes. She didn't need the monitor to confirm it. She could see it in the way his lips had gone the color of ash, in the shallow, frantic rise of his chest, in the faint tracheal shift she'd caught the instant she'd laid eyes on him. The trauma bay around her had the particular controlled tension of a shift that had been running too hot for too long. 3 ambulances in the last hour, 2 attendings pulled thin across 4 critical patients, and now this one, a construction worker in his 40s who'd taken a fall from scaffolding and arrived talking, alert and, by every visible measure, stable. It was the kind of patient that lulled a room into a false sense of security, the kind that killed people precisely because nothing about him looked urgent enough to demand full attention. 26 years old, 6 years a trauma nurse at Blackwood Memorial, and every instinct in her body was screaming the same word: pneumothorax, tension, now. "Dr. Kane," she said, her voice level, controlled, the voice of someone who had said far more dangerous things to far more dangerous people than a hospital's chief of surgery. "He's decompensating. Trachea's deviating left. I think it's a tension pneumo, and I think we need a needle in his chest before we lose him." Dr. Aldous Kane didn't even look up from the chart in his hands. He was 54 years old, silver-templed, the kind of surgeon whose reputation had long ago outgrown his patience for being questioned by anyone beneath him in the hospital's rigid hierarchy. "We're waiting on imaging," he said, flat, dismissive, the words of a man reciting policy rather than treating a patient. "Standard protocol. I don't operate off nursing intuition, Ms. Callahan." He doesn't have time for imaging. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when someone has said something they weren't supposed to say. Kane finally looked at her, and there was nothing in his expression but irritation, the look of a man who had built his entire identity around never being wrong in front of an audience. "Get her off my floor," he said to no one and everyone at once. Now. What Dr. Kane didn't know, what almost no one inside Blackwood Memorial knew, was that 4 years before she'd ever put on a pair of hospital scrubs, Maya Callahan had been Captain Maya Callahan of the United States Army, a flight medic attached to a Ranger battalion, the kind of soldier who had made split-second airway decisions in the back of a Black Hawk at 2,000 feet, with rounds still cracking outside the fuselage. She had a silver star folded into a drawer at home that she had never once mentioned to a single person at this hospital. She hadn't come here to be a hero. She'd come here to be ordinary. And in the space of 30 seconds, that ordinary life was about to end. Maya had left the Army the way a lot of people leave things they loved too much to talk about. Quietly and without looking back. She'd served 2 deployments, the second of which had ended with a helicopter down in bad terrain. 3 wounded operators, and Maya keeping all 3 of them alive for 11 hours until an extraction team finally reached the ridge. The story of that day had earned her a medal, a promotion, and a level of respect inside her unit that most people spend entire careers chasing. It had also given her nightmares that took years to fade and a distrust of her own memories that never fully went away. When she came home, she didn't want medals. She wanted a locker, a badge, and a job where the stakes were still real but the chain of command made sense, where there were doctors above her, systems around her, backup she'd never had in the field. She went to nursing school on the GI Bill, graduated near the top of her class, and took the first trauma position she was offered at a mid-sized regional hospital far from any base, far from anyone who might recognize the name Callahan and start asking questions she didn't want to answer. For 6 years, she'd been exactly what she wanted to be. Competent, quiet, unremarkable. She showed up early. She never called in sick. She had a way of staying calm in chaos that her coworkers chalked up to a naturally steady temperament, never guessing it was the residue of something far heavier. She kept a small challenge coin in her locker, the only physical reminder she allowed herself of the life she used to live, and she never once let anyone at Blackwood Memorial see it. The night the helicopter went down had never fully left her. She could still recall the exact angle of the rotor blades against the moonlight in the seconds before impact, the sound of metal folding in on itself, the sudden ringing silence that followed before the screaming started. She had pulled herself free of the wreckage with a fractured wrist she didn't discover until hours later, and instead of waiting for help, instead of tending to herself first, she had crawled back toward the wreckage to reach the three men still trapped inside. One had a collapsed lung. One had lost enough blood that his lips had already begun to lose their color. One was unconscious and barely breathing, his leg pinned beneath twisted metal that took nearly 20 minutes to clear. She remembered talking to all three of them the entire time, not because she believed the words mattered medically, but because she'd learned that the sound of a calm voice could sometimes hold a person together longer than any bandage could. She remembered the exact moment the extraction team's lights finally appeared over the ridge, 11 hours after the crash, and the strange, hollow relief that came with realizing she hadn't lost anyone, that 11 hours of impossible decisions had somehow added up to 3 men going home instead of 3 flags being folded for grieving families. She had never told anyone at Blackwood Memorial that story, not even in fragments. It wasn't shame that kept her quiet. It was something closer to protection, a sense that stories like that one, once spoken aloud in the wrong room, tended to change the way people looked at you forever, and she had wanted, more than almost anything, to be looked at as ordinary. Dr. Kane had joined the hospital 2 years after she did, inheriting the chief of surgery position through a mix of seniority and political maneuvering that had very little to do with bedside skill. He ran his floor like a man who had never once been told no and had decided, somewhere along the way, that the sound of his own certainty was the same thing as being right. He didn't dislike Maya specifically. He simply didn't see her, not as a colleague, not as an equal, not as anyone whose judgment could possibly outweigh his own. To him, she was a set of competent hands that existed to execute his instructions, nothing more. She had learned over those 6 years exactly how far she could push before it cost her something. She'd pushed today, and now she was about to find out the price. There had been warning signs, if anyone had cared to look for them. 6 months earlier, Maya had caught an early sign of sepsis in a post-op patient that 2 attendings had missed entirely, flagging it so quietly and so early that the incident barely registered as anything more than good nursing. 3 months before that, she'd correctly predicted a cardiac patient's decline nearly 40 minutes before his monitors confirmed it, moving him to a higher level of care based on nothing more than the color of his skin and the rhythm of his breathing. Neither incident had earned her recognition. Both had earned her a quiet reputation among the newer nurses as someone worth watching closely, someone who seemed to see things before they happened, though none of them understood why. What none of her colleagues knew was that this particular instinct, the one that let her read a dying body before the machines caught up, had been trained into her under circumstances none of them could imagine. She had learned it in the back of helicopters with no ground crew, in makeshift aid stations built from parachute silk and improvised tourniquets, in moments where the difference between a save and a loss came down to a decision made in under 10 seconds with no one to consult and no room for hesitation. Blackwood Memorial, with its imaging machines and its specialists and its careful, deliberate protocols, had never once put her in a position where she needed those instincts as urgently as she had needed them years earlier. Until today, they had simply been background noise, quiet and unused, humming beneath the surface of an ordinary life she had built entirely on purpose. Dr. Kane had never asked why a trauma nurse with her particular calm under pressure had chosen this field. If he had asked, she might have told him some small piece of the truth. Not everything, never everything, but enough. He never asked. To him, quiet competence required no explanation, only obedience. 10 minutes after she'd said the word tension in front of the entire trauma bay, Maya was standing in the corridor outside the ICU with her supervisor, a tired, sympathetic woman named Denise Farrow, delivering the news Maya had already braced herself for. "He's suspending you pending review," Denise said, not meeting her eyes. Insubordination, going around a direct order, second-guessing a physician's clinical judgment in front of the patient and the team. "I fought it, Maya. I want you to know that. But he's the chief, and he's not backing down. Was I wrong? Maya asked. It wasn't defensive. It was a genuine question, asked the way she asked most things, plainly, without theatrics. Denise hesitated. The imaging came back after you left the floor. It was a tension pneumo. They had to decompress him in a hurry. She paused. You were right. It doesn't matter. That's not how this works, and you know it. For what it's worth, Denise added, glancing down the hallway to make sure they were alone, half the floor already thinks this is ridiculous. Nobody's saying it out loud, obviously, but you don't spend 6 years being the person everyone quietly trusts and then have that erased in one afternoon just because Kane's pride got bruised. It doesn't matter what the floor thinks, Maya said, though there was no bitterness in it, only the flat acceptance of someone who had learned a long time ago that fairness and outcomes rarely traveled together. It matters what's in my file. It matters whether I still have a job next week. Denise didn't have an answer for that, and they both knew it. She reached out and squeezed Maya's arm briefly, the kind of gesture that meant more than any of the words either of them had managed so far, and then excused herself to deal with the rest of a shift that was, for everyone except Maya, continuing exactly as it had before. Maya nodded slowly. She did know it. She'd known it the moment the words left her mouth, the same way she'd known years ago that certain calls made in the field would never show up on paper, never earn her credit, never be understood by anyone who hadn't been standing in the dirt beside her. Some decisions you make because they're right, not because they're safe. She'd learned that lesson a long time before Blackwood Memorial had ever hired her, and some part of her, the part that still woke up at 3 a.m. with her heart pounding from dreams she never fully remembered, had known this day might come eventually. Dr. Kane, for his part, had not enjoyed the confrontation nearly as much as his tone in the trauma bay might have suggested. Alone in his office an hour later, he found himself staring at the imaging results that had come back after Maya was already gone, the ones that confirmed exactly what she'd told him, and feeling a discomfort he wasn't entirely willing to name. He told himself the outcome didn't change anything. Protocol existed precisely for moments when someone's confidence outran their authority, he reasoned, and if he let one correct guess undermine the entire structure of how his floor operated, he'd be inviting chaos every time a nurse felt strongly enough about a hunch. It was a tidy argument, and he repeated it to himself several times until it almost felt true. What he didn't examine, what he wasn't yet ready to examine, was the small, persistent voice reminding him that Maya Callahan had never once, in 6 years, been wrong about a call like this. He filed the thought away the same way he filed away most things that threatened his certainty, and moved on to his next patient. She cleaned out her locker in silence. The challenge coin went into her jacket pocket, cold and heavy against her palm. A photograph of her unit, faces she hadn't spoken to in years, went into a small canvas bag along with a spare pair of shoes and a paperback novel she'd been meaning to finish for 3 months. 6 years reduced to a 10-minute walk and a bag that weighed almost nothing. Dr. Kane found her at the elevator, apparently unable to resist the urge to have the last word. "This isn't personal, Ms. Callahan," he said in the tone of a man who genuinely believed that made it better. "You need to understand the chain of command exists for a reason. Doctors give orders. Nurses execute them. That's how hospitals function. That's how people stay alive." Maya looked at him for a long moment, and something flickered behind her eyes. Not anger, exactly, but something colder and more settled, the look of someone who had survived things this man couldn't begin to picture. "I've seen what happens when nobody's willing to speak up," she said quietly. "I've watched people die because everyone in the room was more afraid of being wrong than of losing the patient. I'd rather be suspended than watch that happen again." She didn't wait for a response. The elevator doors closed, and she rode down to the ground floor alone, carrying a bag full of 6 years and a coin that represented 4 more that no one at Blackwood Memorial had ever known about. The ride down felt longer than it should have. She watched the numbers tick past on the small digital display, and for the first time in a long while, she let herself think, really think, about the two lives she'd lived and how completely she'd tried to keep them separate. There had been a version of her once who wore a different uniform, who answered to a different name in official reports, who had learned to sleep in 3-minute increments and eat standing up and make peace with the fact that not every patient she touched would survive the flight. That version of her had never fully disappeared. She had simply folded her away, packed her down small enough to fit inside a canvas bag in a locker drawer, and told herself that was enough. Standing in that elevator, Maya realized she had spent 6 years being careful never to let anyone see the full shape of what she was capable of, and today, the one time she'd let a fraction of it show through, it had cost her everything she'd built. There was a bitter symmetry to it that she didn't have the energy to examine closely. She'd survived 2 deployments by trusting her instincts without hesitation. She'd lost a job by doing the exact same thing in a building with climate control and imaging suites, and absolutely no one shooting at her. Some environments, she thought, punished you for being right in a way that combat never had. In the field, the only judge that mattered was whether the patient lived. Here, apparently, the judge was a man with a chart in his hand and an ego that couldn't survive being wrong in front of an audience. Maya stepped out into the parking lot and let herself breathe for the first time in an hour. The afternoon sun was harsh and indifferent, the kind of light that made everything look slightly too sharp, too real. She stood there for a moment with the canvas bag against her hip, running through the calculations every person runs through after losing a job they'd built a life around. Rent, savings, what came next? Whether 6 years of good work could survive one afternoon of being right at the wrong moment. She didn't get far before she heard it. A low, mechanical rumble, distant at first, then rapidly closing, the unmistakable cadence of heavy engines moving with purpose. She turned toward the sound and felt something in her chest tighten with old, familiar recognition. 3 military transport trucks rounded the corner onto the hospital's access road, followed by a pair of black SUVs moving in tight formation, and above them, cutting low over the tree line, a medevac helicopter descending fast toward the hospital's landing pad. Radios crackled through open windows. Soldiers in combat gear began pouring out of the vehicles before they'd fully stopped, shouting coordinates, calling for stretchers, moving with the controlled urgency of people who had done this before and hoped never to have to do it again. Maya's pulse spiked, not with fear, but with something deeper and more automatic. The part of her nervous system that had spent 2 deployments learning to read chaos the way other people read a room. She caught fragments of the radio traffic as soldiers rushed past her toward the hospital entrance. A training exercise gone wrong at a nearby base, an armored vehicle rollover, multiple casualties, 1 critical, a general officer among the injured personnel being brought in for evaluation. A second wave of vehicles arrived less than a minute behind the first, and the scale of what was happening began to reveal itself in pieces. This wasn't a single casualty being rushed in for evaluation. It was a full mass-casualty response, the kind hospitals ran tabletop drills for once a year and hoped never to actually face. Soldiers carried soldiers on improvised litters. A medic from the convoy shouted for a burn kit that Blackwood Memorial's ER, built for car accidents and holiday weekend overdoses, didn't stock in nearly the quantity the situation demanded. Somewhere near the ambulance bay, a young private sat on the curb clutching his own arm, staring blankly ahead in the particular distant way people stare when their mind hasn't yet caught up to what their body already knows has happened to them. Maya recognized the shape of it immediately. The specific texture of chaos that exists only in the earliest minutes of a disaster, before anyone has managed to impose order on it. She'd lived inside that exact texture more times than she could count, and some old, buried part of her brain began cataloging the scene automatically, sorting casualties by severity, even from 50 yards away, identifying which stretchers needed attention in the next 5 minutes and which could hold for 20. It was a skill she hadn't used in 4 years, and it came back to her without hesitation, the way certain languages never fully leave you even after decades of silence. Inside the hospital, the overhead system was already blaring, calling every available staff member to the trauma floor. Through the glass doors, Maya could see the chaos beginning to build. Too few hands, too little warning. A hospital that trained for car accidents and cardiac events suddenly staring down a mass casualty scenario it had never rehearsed for at this scale. Dr. Kane appeared in the doorway moments later, his composure fraying at the edges, barking instructions into a phone while simultaneously trying to organize a response team that was short-staffed, underbriefed, and visibly unsettled by the sight of military personnel flooding their lobby. Maya watched him from across the parking lot. The man who had just spent the morning explaining to her exactly how chains of command were supposed to work, now scrambling to build one from scratch with half the pieces missing. A young soldier broke away from the convoy and jogged toward the nearest figure in scrubs, which happened to be Maya. He had no idea who she was, no idea about the suspension, the locker, the 6 years, or the 4 years before that. All he saw was someone dressed like medical staff, and right now, that was the only qualification that mattered. "Ma'am, we need hands inside," he said, breathless. "Now." Maya looked down at the canvas bag still hanging from her shoulder. She looked back at the hospital doors, at the stretchers already emerging from the trucks, at soldiers carrying soldiers, blood soaking through uniforms, faces gray with shock. Every instinct she had spent 6 years quietly folding away came surging back to the surface in a single heartbeat. She let the bag slide off her shoulder onto the pavement. And she ran. She didn't think about the suspension. She didn't think about Dr. Kane, or the review pending against her, or the 6 years she'd just watched collapse in the span of a single hallway conversation. None of it mattered anymore, not in any way that registered. Somewhere behind her sternum, a switch had flipped that she hadn't touched in 4 years, and everything about the world sharpened into the particular narrow clarity she remembered from every mass casualty event she'd ever worked. Sound fell away except for what mattered. Movement slowed except for what needed to happen next. She was no longer a suspended nurse standing in a hospital parking lot. She was a medic walking into the only kind of chaos she had ever truly understood. Behind her, Dr. Kane caught sight of her crossing back through the sliding doors and opened his mouth to say something, to remind her, perhaps out of pure reflex, that she wasn't supposed to be there. Whatever he intended to say died somewhere before it reached his throat, because in that moment even he could see, with sudden and uncomfortable clarity, that whatever was walking back through those doors bore very little resemblance to the nurse he had escorted out that morning. The trauma bay had transformed into something closer to a forward operating base than a hospital wing, and Maya moved through it the way she used to move through triage lines under fire. Not frantic, not hesitant, but with the eerie, focused calm of someone who had done this exact thing 100 times before and had simply been waiting, without realizing it, for the chance to do it again. She didn't ask permission. She didn't wait for someone to hand her authority. She tore her jacket off, snapped on a pair of gloves from a supply cart, and began calling out triage priorities before anyone in the room had time to question who she was or why she thought she had the right to lead. "This one's critical. Airways compromised. Get him to Bay 2 now," she said, moving past a stretcher without breaking stride. "This one can wait. Pressure's holding steady. You—" She pointed at a junior nurse frozen near the doorway, eyes wide with panic. "Start a line on the soldier by the window. He's bleeding out faster than his vitals are showing." Her voice cut through the noise the way a blade cuts through fabric. Clean, precise, impossible to ignore. The junior nurse moved immediately, not because she recognized any authority in Maya's badge, since Maya no longer had one, but because there was something in the tone itself, an unmistakable certainty that comes only from someone who has made these exact calls before and lived through the consequences of getting them wrong. Word moved through the trauma bay in minutes. Someone said the nurse who'd been let go that morning was back. Someone else said she was running the floor like she'd been doing it her entire life. Dr. Kane, still trying to organize his own fractured response near the nurses' station, heard the murmur and pushed through the crowd to see for himself, certain there had been some mistake, certain that whoever was giving orders in his trauma bay had no business doing so. What he found stopped him mid-stride. Maya stood at the center of the chaos. Blood streaked across her forearms, calling triage decisions with a precision that matched, and in more than one case exceeded, what his own attending physicians were managing under the same pressure. She wasn't guessing. She wasn't improvising out of desperation. She was executing a system, a real one, built from years of experience he had never once considered she might possess. He opened his mouth to remind her that she had no authority on this floor, that she'd been suspended not 6 hours earlier, but the words caught somewhere in his throat and refused to come out. Something about the scene in front of him made the objection feel suddenly, absurdly small. For nearly an hour, Maya moved between 6 different bays without pause, her hands steady even as the numbers of incoming wounded continued to climb. She reset a dislocated shoulder with a technique that made a resident's eyes widen. She caught a slow arterial bleed hidden beneath a soldier's body armor that had gone unnoticed by 2 other staff members already checking his vitals. She talked a panicking young private through the first few minutes of shock with a calm, low voice that seemed to reach him even through the haze of blood loss and adrenaline, telling him exactly what she was doing and why, the way she'd learned to talk to frightened soldiers years earlier when the sound of a familiar voice was sometimes the only thing keeping someone conscious. A junior physician, fresh out of residency and clearly out of his depth, found himself following her lead without being told to, deferring to her calls on airway management and fluid resuscitation with the quiet relief of someone grateful to have found a competent hand to hold on to in the middle of a disaster he hadn't been trained for. By the time the last of the initial wave had been stabilized, 3 separate members of the trauma team had, without any formal instruction, begun treating Maya as the de facto lead of the entire response, deferring to her triage calls before checking with anyone else in the building. That was when the doors at the far end of the bay opened and the room changed a second time. A tall man in a service uniform stepped through the doors, flanked by 2 aides who kept a respectful half-step behind him, the kind of formation that only exists around someone whose presence rearranges a room the moment they enter it. 4 silver stars sat on each shoulder. General Marcus Whitfield had come to check on his soldiers personally, the way he always did when his people were hurt, and the moment he crossed the threshold, every uniformed body in the hallway snapped straighter without needing to be told. He moved through the trauma bay with the focused urgency of a man used to walking into disaster zones, scanning the room for his wounded until his eyes landed on the nurse in the center of it all, the one giving orders with a calm, clipped authority that every soldier in the room seemed to instinctively obey. He stopped. For a long moment, General Whitfield simply stared, as though his brain was working to reconcile 2 images that didn't belong in the same place. Then his expression shifted, disbelief giving way to something closer to recognition, and finally to something that looked almost like relief. "Captain Callahan," he said, his voice carrying easily across the sudden quiet of the room. "I'll be damned." The trauma bay went still in the particular way rooms go still when something enormous has just been said out loud. Not nurse, not Ms. Callahan, Captain. Dr. Kane's head turned so fast it was almost comedic, his eyes moving from the general to Maya and back again, his expression cycling rapidly through confusion, disbelief, and the first cold edge of something that looked uncomfortably like shame. Maya turned toward the voice, and for just a moment, the composed, clinical mask she'd worn all day slipped, revealing something younger and more startled underneath. "General Whitfield," she said quietly. "I didn't know you were the one coming in." "One of my captains rolled his vehicle running a training exercise I approved," Whitfield said, closing the distance between them. "I came to see him myself. Didn't expect to find the medic who kept me breathing on a mountainside 4 years ago running triage in the same building." The room seemed to hold its breath collectively. A murmur rippled through the staff, soldiers and civilians alike exchanging glances, trying to process what they'd just heard. Dr. Kane stood frozen near the nurse's station, his authority, his certainty, his entire understanding of the last several hours quietly collapsing under the weight of 2 words. "You know her, sir?" one of the aides asked, though the question seemed almost unnecessary at this point. "Know her," Whitfield repeated, a short, humorless laugh escaping him. "She kept 3 of my men alive on a ridge in conditions most surgeons wouldn't survive walking into, let alone operating in. She held the pressure on a chest wound with her bare hands for 6 hours because we didn't have the equipment to do it properly. I put her in for a Silver Star myself." He turned, taking in the room, the stretchers, the blood, the exhausted staff who had clearly been following her lead for the better part of an hour. "And, judging by what I just walked into, it looks like she hasn't lost a step." Dr. Kane's voice, when it finally came, was smaller than anyone in the room had ever heard it. "She was suspended this morning," he said, though even as the words left his mouth they sounded less like an explanation and more like a confession. Whitfield turned to look at him directly for the first time, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Suspended for what exactly? Around them, the trauma bay had gone almost entirely silent. Staff members pausing mid-motion, wounded soldiers on stretchers watching the exchange with the particular attentiveness of people who understood exactly what was happening, even through the haze of pain medication. One of the aides shifted his weight, clearly recognizing the tone in his commander's voice from other rooms, other conversations, moments when Whitfield's calm was far more dangerous than any shout could have been. Even the soldier who had first recognized Maya, still lying on a gurney nearby with a fresh IV line taped to his arm, turned his head to watch, a faint, satisfied smile crossing his face despite the pain etched into it. Kane hesitated, visibly searching for a version of the story that didn't sound as small as it actually was. For going around a clinical order, making an independent call on a patient's diagnosis. Was she right? The silence that followed answered the question more clearly than words could have. "She was right, sir," Denise said quietly from the doorway, stepping forward before Kane could find a way to soften it. The patient had a tension pneumothorax. She caught it before imaging did. It saved his life. General Whitfield looked back at Maya, something unmistakably proud settling into his expression, and then back at Dr. Kane, whose face had gone the color of the sterile walls surrounding him. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Whitfield said, his voice calm, measured, and somehow more devastating for its restraint than any shout could have been. "You suspended one of the most capable trauma medics I have ever served alongside, a decorated combat medic who has kept more people alive under fire than most of the physicians in this building will treat in their entire careers, for having the judgment to be right when you were wrong." Kane opened his mouth. Nothing came out. "That's not a rhetorical question, Doctor." "I didn't know her background," Kane finally managed, and even he seemed to hear how insufficient it sounded the moment the words left his mouth. "No," Whitfield said. "You didn't ask. You didn't have to know her rank to know she was right. You just had to be willing to listen." Whitfield let the silence stretch a moment longer before he spoke again, his voice quieter now but no less absolute. "I've stood in rooms with generals who couldn't make the calls this woman made without blinking," he said, looking around at the staff still watching from the edges of the bay. "I've watched surgeons with twice her years of training freeze under a fraction of this pressure. She didn't freeze. She hasn't frozen once since I walked through that door. And from what I'm hearing, she didn't freeze this morning either, when it would have been a great deal easier to just do what she was told." He turned back to Kane. "You don't get to call that insubordination, Doctor. You call that exactly what it is. Judgment. The kind you can't teach and the kind you clearly don't recognize when you see it." The hours that followed blurred into a relentless, exhausting rhythm of triage, stabilization, and surgery. 14 wounded soldiers moved through Blackwood Memorial's trauma bay before the day was finished, each one requiring decisions that couldn't wait for committee approval or a second scan. Maya didn't stop moving. She trained junior nurses on the fly, calmed frightened patients with the same steady voice she'd used to calm frightened soldiers years earlier, and made calls that saved lives precisely because she refused to second-guess herself the way this hospital had spent the morning training her to. By the time the last patient had been stabilized and the controlled chaos of the trauma bay began settling into something resembling order, the sun had dropped low outside the windows, painting the hallway in long amber light. General Whitfield had stayed the entire time, checking on his wounded soldiers between updates from his aides, watching Maya work with the quiet satisfaction of a commander who had never doubted the caliber of the medic he'd once trusted with his life. It was the hospital's administrator, a composed, sharp-eyed woman named Renata Okafor, who arrived partway through the crisis after hearing reports of an unprecedented casualty event being handled with startling efficiency. She found herself standing in a corridor that smelled of antiseptic and adrenaline, surrounded by exhausted staff and grateful soldiers, asking the one question that would end up echoing through Blackwood Memorial for months afterward. "Who organized this response?" she asked, looking around at 14 stabilized patients and a trauma team that, against every likelihood, had held together under pressure it had never trained for. "Who ran this floor today?" A junior nurse, still trembling faintly from the adrenaline of the last several hours, looked up with something close to awe in her eyes. "The nurse Dr. Kane suspended this morning," she said. "Captain Callahan. She came back and saved every single one of them." Renata's gaze swept the hallway until it landed on Maya, who stood near the nurse's station, blood dried on her forearms, exhaustion carved into every line of her face, the canvas bag from the parking lot finally retrieved and resting untouched at her feet. Renata crossed the distance between them with quick, deliberate steps, and for the first time all day, someone in hospital leadership looked at Maya as though they finally understood exactly who they'd been standing next to for 6 years. "Dr. Kane suspended you this morning," Renata said quietly, "and you came back anyway." Maya met her eyes without flinching, the same steady calm she'd carried through every triage call, every stretcher, every hour of the last 12. "People needed help," she said simply. "That's the only chain of command I've ever really trusted." General Whitfield lingered near the doorway a moment longer, watching the scene with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had, in his own way, just watched a debt get repaid. He crossed back to where Maya stood and extended a hand, which she took without hesitation, the formality of the gesture at odds with the exhaustion still written across both their faces. "I never got the chance to properly thank you," he said. "Not the way it deserved. There's a difference between a citation in a file and looking someone in the eye and telling them you're alive because of what they did." He paused, glancing once around the trauma bay, at the stretchers being wheeled toward recovery, at the staff beginning, finally, to exhale. "Seems like you've been doing the same thing here for 6 years and nobody bothered to look you in the eye either." "It's a different kind of work," Maya said. "Quieter. I didn't need anyone to look me in the eye for it. I just needed them to trust me when it mattered." "And did they?" Maya glanced toward Dr. Kane, still standing silent against the far wall, and then back at the general. "Not always," she admitted, "but enough people did, most days. That's usually all it takes to keep a floor running." Whitfield studied her for a moment, something thoughtful crossing his face. "For what it's worth, Captain, the Army would take you back tomorrow if you ever wanted it. Reserve component, active duty, whatever suited you. That offer doesn't expire." "I appreciate that, sir," Maya said, and there was real warmth in it, though she shook her head slightly. "But I think I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. This floor needs people who know how to hold it together when things go sideways. Today just reminded everyone that I already know how to do that." Whitfield smiled, the first fully unguarded expression he'd shown since walking through the doors. "Then Blackwood Memorial is luckier than it currently deserves." He nodded once, the kind of nod that in his world passed for the highest form of respect, and turned to check on the rest of his soldiers, leaving Maya standing in the middle of a trauma bay that, for the first time in her 6 years there, finally understood exactly who had been standing among them all along. Behind them, Dr. Kane stood alone near the wall, saying nothing, because there was nothing left to say. The nurse he had dismissed for trusting her own judgment had just proven, in the most undeniable way possible, that her instincts had been forged in places he could never fully imagine, against consequences he had never once had to face. General Whitfield requested a private meeting with Renata Okafor before he left that evening, and though no one outside that room ever heard the full conversation, Its effects rippled through Blackwood Memorial almost immediately. By the following morning, Maya's suspension had been formally reversed. Her record cleared of any disciplinary note, and a quiet internal review had been launched into how a decorated combat medic had spent 6 years inside the hospital's walls without a single person in leadership recognizing what she was capable of. The review, when it finally concluded 3 weeks later, produced changes that extended well beyond Maya's individual case. Renata Okafor implemented a new policy requiring senior physicians to formally document their reasoning whenever they overruled a nursing assessment during an active trauma case, a small procedural change that nonetheless represented a significant shift in how much weight nursing judgment was given on paper. A mentorship program was quietly established, pairing veteran combat medics who had transitioned into civilian nursing with hospital leadership, an initiative that grew, within a year, into a partnership with 2 nearby military treatment facilities. None of it happened quickly, and none of it happened because anyone suddenly became a different person overnight. But Blackwood Memorial, in its own slow, bureaucratic way, began to change. Dr. Kane was not fired. That was not how these things typically worked, and Maya, when asked later whether she wanted him removed, had simply shaken her head. "I don't need him gone," she said. "I need him to listen next time someone tells him something he doesn't want to hear." The two of them spoke only once more that week, in a brief, awkward exchange near the supply closet that neither of them ever repeated to anyone else. Kane had approached her stiffly, clearly uncomfortable, and after a long pause admitted that he'd read her service record in full the night before. All of it. The deployments, the commendations, the 11 hours on that ridge. "I owe you an apology," he said, and the words seemed to cost him something physical to say. "Not because of who you turned out to be, because of how I treated you before I had any idea." Maya had studied him for a moment, weighing the sincerity of it before answering. "You don't owe me an apology for not knowing my rank," she said. "You owe every nurse on this floor an apology for needing a rank to take them seriously in the first place." Kane hadn't had a response for that. He'd simply nodded and walked away, and something about the exchange seemed to settle into him more permanently than anything a formal review board could have imposed. But something in the hospital's culture shifted after that day regardless, quietly and permanently. Nurses who had spent years being talked over in trauma rooms found themselves being asked for their opinions instead of being asked to keep them to themselves. Kane, for his part, never spoke to Maya about the incident directly again, but those who worked closest to him noticed a difference in the weeks that followed. A pause before he dismissed an idea, a willingness to ask a question instead of issuing an order, small adjustments that added up to something that almost resembled humility. Maya went back to work 3 days later, not because the hospital had begged her to, though they had, but because the patients needed her, and that had always been the only reason that ever really mattered to her. She kept her challenge coin in her locker, same as always. She didn't tell her story to anyone who didn't already know it. She still showed up early, still stayed calm in chaos, still moved through trauma bays with the same quiet, steady competence that had defined her for 6 years before anyone had bothered to ask what that competence had cost her to build. But something had changed, even if it was small, even if most people wouldn't have noticed it from the outside. When Maya spoke up now, people listened, not because of a rank stitched into a uniform she no longer wore, but because a 4-star general had once said her name out loud in a room full of people who needed to hear it, and some truths, once spoken, are impossible to unhear. Months later, long after the story had faded from the hospital's daily conversations, a new nurse joined the trauma floor, young and nervous and clearly unsure of her footing in a department known for its intensity. On her 3rd day, she watched Maya call a diagnosis that contradicted an attending's initial read, watched the room go quiet for a half-second the way rooms sometimes still did, and watched the attending, after a brief pause, order the test Maya had suggested instead of dismissing it outright. The patient turned out to need immediate surgery. The new nurse asked one of the senior staff afterward how Maya had known, how she always seemed to know, and the senior nurse only smiled and told her it was a long story, one that had started with a suspension and ended with a 4-star general walking through a set of double doors. Maya never sought out the recognition that followed her after that day. She still preferred the quiet version of herself, the one who showed up early and left late and let her work speak for itself rather than the story behind it. But she no longer felt the need to hide the parts of her history that had made her who she was. She kept the challenge coin in her pocket sometimes now instead of locked away in a drawer, not because she needed anyone to see it, but because she no longer needed to pretend it wasn't there. Some chapters of a life aren't meant to stay buried forever. Sometimes it just takes the right person, saying the right name, in front of the right room, to bring them back into the light. If a story like Maya's stayed with you, if you believe the quiet ones are often the strongest people in the room, hit subscribe for more stories of hidden heroes and the moments when the truth finally comes to light.